welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay, and I'm a naval historian and historian in general, and I love talking about the past and sharing what I know with people. So if you're new here, I would definitely recommend going back and watching last week's video, because this is the second of a 9-part series in which I read my entirety of my master's thesis in the first 8 weeks, and then give you an update of where my research has gone since my master's thesis has been written back in 2020. The thesis is entitled The Submarine and Maritime Strategy, an examination of the role in which the submarine filled in early 20th century maritime strategy. And today I will be going through the first chapter. Last week I did the introduction. So this first chapter is just simply entitled Chapter 1, Historiography. And so let's begin. During the past century of scholarship on the events of the Anglo-German naval arms race, there have emerged 3 principal groups of thought involving the activities of the Royal Navy during the Fisher era. Those of the traditional, evolutionary, and revolutionary interpretations of Fisher's policies, which will be expanded upon below. The study of the Imperial German Navy during this era has centered around Kaiser Wilhelm II's desire to build a great navy and Tirpitz' efforts to fulfill his emperor's dream while creating a legitimate threat to the Royal Navy's supremacy. As for the U.S. Navy, the pre-war era is dominated by the efforts of Roosevelt to modernize the fleet and build the Panama Canal, and by the influence of Mahan on those activities. With this in mind, it is best to discuss the arguments presented in the secondary literature as they fall into these categories. Therefore, the historiographical analysis will begin with an examination of the 3 groups of Royal Navy historiography, followed by that of the Imperial German Navy, the U.S. Navy, and ending with the submarine and torpedo. The traditional group. The original scholars, along with their present-day adherents, are in the traditional group in regards to the Royal Navy. The line of thought associated with them is that Fisher's policies were in response to the growing German high seas fleet and the threat that it posed to British interests. Anyone who chooses to study the naval operations of the First World War would benefit by beginning with Arthur J. Marder's 5-part From Dreadnought to Scapa Flow. Marder is viewed as the leader of the traditional group, and his book series on British naval operations before and during the First World War are considered by many to have cemented this concept in the historiography. Reinforcing the argument that the quickly expanding German Navy was viewed as a direct threat to the Royal Navy is Thomas Hober's in Prevail or Perish, Anglo-German Naval Concentration at the beginning of the 20th century, especially after the defeat of the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. To complement Marder's work, there are many sources available that discuss the Royal Navy as traditionally understood. One recent volume, The Rules of the Game, Jutland and British Naval Command from Andrew Gordon, discusses the culture of the late Victorian and Edwardian era officer corps that led the Royal Navy during the First World War, allowing the reader to understand the background of the strategies and tactics employed, and providing background to the British view of the German Navy as a luxury fleet. Additionally, Paul Hagee's article, The Royal Navy and War Planning in the Fisher Era, provides a glance at the war planning process in the British Admiralty during the Fisher Era, especially with the efforts of the Ballard Commission, and shows that much of the planning was centered on a potential war with Germany. The Revolutionary Group. With the mass declassification of documents related to World War I and events leading to that conflict in the 1960s and 1970s, the revolutionary group of Anglo-German naval arms race scholars began to emerge. Their argument is that Fisher, while trying to fundamentally reform the Royal Navy to take advantage of new technology and introduce a cost-efficient fleet to the world, The leading scholar of this group is Nicholas A. Lambert, who has written numerous articles and a book on Fisher's efforts at the Admiralty. Central to his work is the theme that the financial situation that Great Britain found itself in after the disastrous Second Boer War and the desire by the Liberals to expand social programs led Fisher to reform the Royal Navy in a cost-saving effort. His book, Sir John Fisher's Naval Revolution, and articles Admiral Sir John Fisher and the Concept of Flotilla Defense, 1904 to 1909, British Naval Policy, 1913-1914, Financial Limitations and Strategic Revolution, and Strategic Command and Control for Maneuver Warfare, creation of the Royal Navy's war room system, explored the Fisher reforms in detail. An equally important figure in arguing that Fisher's efforts were evolutionary has been John Tetsuro Sumida, who argues that the battlecruiser, not the dreadnought, was Fisher's preferred capital ship. His book, In Defense of Naval Supremacy, Finance, Technology, and British Naval Policy, 1889-1914, and the articles Geography, Technology, and British Strategy in the Dreadnought Era, and Sir John Fisher and the Dreadnought, The Sources of Naval Mythology, provide the evidence taken from numerous primary sources to support Sumida's arguments. Writing at a later date than Lambert and Sumida, John Brooks also concluded that Fisher was attempting to reform and revolutionize the Royal Navy around the battlecruiser rather than the battleship. In Dreadnought, Blunder or Stroke of Genius, Brooks shows that the battleship as a naval platform was quickly becoming obsolete. While not explicitly siding with a particular historiographical group, Admiral James Stavridis, in his most recent books, Sailing True North, 10 Admirals, and The Voyage of Character, included a profile on Fisher presenting the First Sea Lord as a revolutionary and a reformer. The Evolutionary Group. Finally, and more recently, is the Revolutionary Group, who argue that the technological developments were in line with the Royal Navy's planning and that Fisher had been given more credit than he should have. As in most historiographies of historical topics, there are also scholars in this third generation that sought to find a balance between the two previous groups, and those who lean towards one side of the debate over the other. One of those is renowned British military historian Peter Padfield, who chose to look at the race to build the massive fleets that sailed into Jutland with the great naval race, Anglo-German naval rivalry, 1900 and 1914, in which he sought that balance. In recent years, Barry Gohl has published his detailed explanation of Winston Churchill's tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty, with Churchill and Fisher, Titans at the Admiralty, which shows the continuing influence of Fisher on British naval policy in the last years before the First World War. Yet this group has only begun to emerge during the years leading up to the centennial of the outbreak of the First World War. The vast majority of the literature has been found in academic journals. Examples, as well as excellent articles, include Christopher M. Bell's Sir John Fisher's Naval Revolution Reconsidered, Winston Churchill at the Admiralty, 1911-1914, Sir John Fisher and the Policy of Strategic Deterrence, 1904-1908 by Richard Dudley, David Owen Morgan with A Revolution in Naval Affairs, Technology, Strategy, and British Policy in the Fisher Era, and finally, New Weapons for New Targets, Sir John Fisher, The Threat from Germany, and the Building of HMS Dreadnought and HMS Invincible, 1902-1907, from Matthew S. Seligman. The Imperial German Navy. Almost as much ink has been spilled regarding the Imperial German Navy as the Royal Navy during this early 20th century era. Unlike the discussion of the Royal Navy under Fisher and his successors, the historiographical argument has consistently been that Kaiser Wilhelm II was jealous of the British and the Royal Navy and desire to have a navy of his own. After struggling to lead the efforts directly, he found the right man with the same desire to build a fleet that could rival the Royal Navy and Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. Providing an overview of the Imperial German Navy specifically is Holger Herweg's luxury fleet, the Imperial German Navy 1888-1918, which provides evidence that supports this argument. It is the biographies of Tirpitz which provide the best starting point for a study of the Imperial German Navy's pre-war planning and construction. First is a short biography from Michael Epkenhans, Tirpitz, architect of the German High Seas Fleet, which summarizes the admiral's life and argues that in the end, Tirpitz failed to achieve his goal of sinking the Royal Navy. An older article, Admirals versus Generals, the War Aims of the Imperial German Navy, 1914 and 1918 from 1972 by Herweg, argues that Kaiser Wilhelm II desired a large navy. However, he was reluctant to risk his investment in combat, much to Tirpitz's dismay. United States Navy. As mentioned earlier, most of the historiography on the U.S. Navy during this era is focused on Roosevelt's modernization efforts, the construction of the Panama Canal, and the further development and refinement of American naval strategy in the wake of Mahan's influence of sea power. Viewing Roosevelt as a leading navalist, that is key to understanding his efforts to modernize the U.S. Navy, which is addressed in Henry J. Hendricks's Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy, the U.S. Navy and the Birth of the American Century. As for the U.S. Navy itself, the influence of Mahan on the development of maritime strategy is a central theme in numerous overviews of this era, such as 100 Years of Sea Power, the U.S. Navy, 1890 to 1990 by George W. Baer, Naval History and Maritime Strategy, collected essays from John B. Hattendorf, and Trent Hone's Learning War, the Evolution of Fighting Doctrine in the U.S. Navy, 1898 to 1945. The focus on naval strategy development in the U.S. Navy did not mean that it ignored potential threats to the United States and the Western Hemisphere. The United States and the German Threat to the Hemisphere, 1905 to 1914, by Melvin Small, discusses the growing German Navy and its potential to usurp American supremacy in the Caribbean in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Early submarine development. The history of the submarine, along with its technical abilities, has been written about for over a century, beginning almost as soon as Great Britain began operating their first Holland boats. Archibald Hurd included a chapter of his 1902 book, Naval Efficiency, The War Readiness of the Fleet, discussing the potential of the submarine and praising the Royal Navy's efforts to develop their version of the vessel. His 1914 book, Our Navy, included mentions of the British submarines alongside that of the dreadnoughts and battlecruisers that captured the attention of the general public. Also released in 1914 was Our Many-Sided Navy by Robert Wilden Nesser, which spent a chapter discussing the torpedo and the American vessels which carried them, particularly destroyers and submarines. However, these contemporary sources can only report on the developments that were made known to the public. The historiography of the submarine during this early period of development has still been centered around the central argument that the navies of the world introduced these vessels to fill the role of coastal and harbor defense. As the submarine gained the ability to operate at longer ranges, Norman Friedman, in Fighting the Great War at Sea, Strategy, Tactics, and Technology, argues that the United States, Great Britain, and Germany were developing tactics that would force their enemy to sail over an ambush line of these vessels. Karl Lautenschlager argues that despite the weaknesses of early submarines, specifically the short weapons range, slow speeds, and difficulty locating enemy shipping, the world commerce rating shifted from cruisers to the submarine during the First World War in his article, Technology and the Evolution of Naval Warfare. Well, not to the extent that Lambert argued. In the Submarine, 1776-1918, Frank Uhlig Jr. ranked the submarine, along with the airplane and wireless radio communications, as a technology that would revolutionize modern warfare. In what seems at first glance to be a casual statement, D.K. Brown observed that the Royal Navy's possession of the most submarines in any fleet in 1914 was proof that the Admiralty was willing to invest in these vessels, in contrast to the myth regarding their reluctance to use them in the Grand Fleet, warship design and development, 1906-1922. A discussion of historiography of submarines would be incomplete if the boat's main weapon, the torpedo, was not discussed. Most of the previous mentioned authors discussed the torpedo to varying degrees in their work. However, it is in light of the development of the large naval guns that the threat of the torpedo can be appreciated. Rodrigo Garcia E. Robertson argues that the increasing range of the torpedo during the late 19th and early 20th century was forcing gun designers to develop weapons with ever-increasing range, allowing the battleships to remain out of the reach of destroyers. Arthur Hazlitt's The Submarine and Sea Power presents a thorough discussion of the development of the White-Helmet torpedo, as does Kelly's biography of Tirpitz. The application of the theory of sea power. One long-standing assumption that has existed in the historiography of the naval aspects of the First World War was that the world's navies were directly influenced by Mahan's writing. However, there is a scholarship that has presented arguments and collaborating evidence that show Mahan's influence had a larger impact on the leadership of the Second World War, not the admirals of the Great War. Instead, Mahan's works were used to justify the naval arms races of the early 20th century, both to the general public and to the legislative entities that would appropriate the funding. Ronald B. St. John argues it was Great Britain's Naval Defense Act of 1889 that should be viewed as the catalyst for the Anglo-German naval arms race. Samida noted that Fisher did not believe that history had any lessons for naval officers of the 20th century, despite quoting sections of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660-1783, at length. Finally, Dirk Bonker argues that Tirpitz formulated his view of sea power while he was deployed to the Far East in 1896 and 1897. On the other side of the Atlantic, the common understanding is that Theodore Roosevelt was heavily influenced by Mahan, as is also the one that is being challenged in the historiography. Peter Karsten argues that Mahan was actually a latecomer to navalist thought, and it was Roosevelt that was at the center. Hendricks shows that Roosevelt's The Naval War 1812 was published 8 years before The Influence of Sea Power, and the two men would support each other's efforts to accomplish their nation's naval goals. Roosevelt had been interested by naval affairs since he was a child, having two uncles that were in the Confederate Navy, one of whom was Rear Admiral James Bullock. His publication of The Naval War 1812 revealed that, like Mahan would do later, Roosevelt will be able to ascertain valuable lessons from the past that can form decisions in the present. Therefore, while the writings of Mahan can and should be referenced to provide context for the actions of Great Britain, Germany, and the United States' naval decisions during the early years of the 20th century, they should not be considered as a work that directly influenced the maritime thinking of many senior naval officers or navalists of that era. Rather, Mahan should be viewed as a contemporary of Fisher Tirpitz, and in the case of Roosevelt, a colleague. Mahan's true gift for the first generation of his readers was that his writings were able to provide the justification that the navalists sought for their desires to expand and modernize their navies. This understanding of how the senior naval officers and navalists responded to the influence of sea power allows for us to better grasp the strategic thinking underlying the naval planning decisions before the First World War. Finally, Mahan's writings, along with the establishment of the Naval War College and similar institutes in other navies, marked the beginning of a new approach to maritime strategy. Gone would be the traditional emphasis on seafaring and engineering. Instead, the focus shifted to an intellectual study of maritime strategy. Historiographical gaps. The decision to explore the submarine and how it factored into pre-war naval planning was a result of a historiographical essay that I had completed in the early days of my pursuit of a master's degree at Southern New Hampshire University. In that essay covering the Anglo-German naval arms race, it became apparent that the submarine has generally been overlooked by scholars in favor of the dreadnoughts and battlecruisers of the era. This seemed to be an interesting omission, especially when taking the impact that unrestricted submarine warfare had in the First World War and its role in drawing the United States into that conflict. Another critical gap, and one that is challenging the research for this thesis, is the lack of secondary sources covering the United States Navy's efforts to develop a submarine and how it would play into its plan. The majority of the research emphasis in this era has been focused on Theodore Roosevelt's efforts to create the modern fleet, Mahan's influence on the development of naval war plans, the global cruise of the Great White Fleet, development of wargaming at the Naval War College, and the construction of the Panama Canal. With all of these events and developments occurring simultaneously, it has appeared that the submarine has been overlooked by scholars. Finally, in a similar vein as the U.S. Navy, there exists a lack of secondary material covering German pre-war naval developments in English. Like with the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy, the focus of previous scholarship has centered on other topics, particularly the efforts to build and maintain the high seas fleet. Historiographical position. As for this thesis and its position in the various groups of historiography in regards to the Royal Navy during this era, it falls into the revolutionary category. Based on this project's research into the primary and secondary sources, it is clear that Fisher was brought into the Admiralty for the purpose of reforming an institution that has stagnated during its long years of naval dominance. Just his advocacy of emerging naval technologies alone could be argued as revolutionary, but there are also his personnel reforms, massive fleet redeployment, and the development of naval plans that allowed for larger roles for smaller vessels like the destroyer and submarine, which showed that Fisher was introducing concepts that were years ahead of his peers. In contrast to the traditional group, in particular Martyr, the notion that Fisher was concerned about the German fleet when he was initially named First Sea Lord ignored the threat that France, as late as the early years of the 20th century, presented to British national security. Rather, it was Fisher's administrative abilities that leapfrogged him over several more senior officers who were better tacticians into Whitehall. As will be examined below, bringing the Royal Navy's expenditures while modernizing the fleet were focuses of Fisher's policies, not the growing threat of the Imperial German Navy or any other potential fleet. In that same regards, the Midas argument for the battlecruiser as Fisher's focus, in contrast to Lambert's case for the submarine and flotilla defense forces, one to choose a side. For this, one should take a clue from Fisher's own autobiographical compilation of records, to find the answer. In that book, Fisher dedicates an entire chapter to letters and reports that emphasize his efforts to develop the submarine. But there is not a similar section on battle cruises. Therefore, the argument that battle cruisers were Fisher's end goal is weakened by the admiral's own writings. Instead, the battle cruiser should be viewed as a stopgap development that was necessary to fill the void that would present itself by shifting the Royal Navy away from battleships into destroyers and submarines. The battle cruiser was required to fill the traditional role of the battleship in fleet actions while providing a deterrent against an invasion of the British Isles until the time that the submarine and the destroyer developed the firepower and endurance to accomplish these tasks on their own. Finally, in regards to the Royal Navy, understanding Fisher's reform program as First Sea Lord between 1904 and 1910 is key to understanding the evolution of maritime technology during the first half of the 20th century. By embracing the potential of the submarine very early in its development, Fisher also laid the foundation of the eventual transition away from the battleship. The last major surface fleet action was during the events of the Battle of Lake Takeoff in 1944. The American Fire Support Task Force in the Surigao Strait crossed the T in their action against a British battle fleet. While off of Samar, the Yamato and her escorts were held off by an American task group of escort carriers and destroyers. Fisher saw that the days of the battleship were nearing an end. When reviewing the navies of the world today, the submarine and the destroyer are the primary naval vessels in commission. The battleships and battlecruisers are long retired. With regards to the Imperial German Navy, the previous historiography places too much emphasis on Tirpitz' efforts to build the Kaiser's fleet of capital ships. In contrast to the established historiography, there is evidence that supports the argument that Tirpitz was in favor of adopting new technology, so long as it could be used offensively. Many previous scholars have reported that while Tirpitz had spent over a decade in the commission that was tasked with refining the early Whitehead torpedoes for German use, they argue that it was primarily due to his lack of desire to be deployed overseas. Yet, as State Secretary of the Imperial Naval Office, Tirpitz continued to provide funding for new torpedo boats in addition to the battleships. With this in mind, it is difficult to argue that Tirpitz was against developing submarines. His autobiography states that he did not want to use these vessels for coastal defense, but rather he intended to use the submarine as another offensive weapon in conjunction with the main battle fleet. While there's still much research that needs to be conducted on American efforts to develop their submarines and establish the strategic role in which they would fill, there is enough evidence to argue that the Monroe Doctrine and the open door policy were the underlying principles guiding naval policy. The submarine was introduced into the United States Navy with the intention that it would fill the role of protecting the American coast, while simultaneously allowing for the battle fleet to operate as a single force and freeing the cruisers for routine patrols and power projection missions. And that is the end of Chapter 1. I'll be back next week, in which I will go over Chapter 2. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, and share this with anyone who's interested. If you're going to leave a comment, please be kind to each other. And I will see you next time.